Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to both of you for joining us today. Dr. Boskin, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about tax reform. There does seem to be a pretty broad bipartisan consensus that that we need some kind of tax reform, especially some kind of tax code simplification. It was in this committee just a few months ago that we had a gentleman who has a PhD in the U.S. tax code system, and we asked him if he did his own taxes, and he said no. I don't, and we asked why, and he said because there is no way I could possibly know whether I was correct. And I think that's indicative of how many Americans feel. So for that and other reasons, I think there's a pretty broad consensus among Republicans and Democrats in both houses of Congress that a simplified approach to the tax code would be better. We need some kind of tax reform. There is not broad bipartisan consensus on what that ought to look like, at least in the sense that some are less inclined than others to say that we need a tax reform package that would yield more revenue when statically scored. But I think most would agree that as long as we're within the world of saying if we're statically scoring something, if we can assume that we're going to be neutral if we keep what we've got, maybe we would be better off reforming the tax code, simplifying it, and leaving it revenue neutral, at least under a statically scored model. And then at that point, some would suggest that that would stimulate economic growth, leaving us free then to see whether or to what extent it did lead to more revenue as a result of economic growth occurring in the wake of passage of that reform package. Would you tend to agree that that would be a good idea?
Yes, I think it's an excellent idea as long as it's primarily of broadening the base and lowering the rates. I think that a tax reform that raised tax rates would be a bad tax reform. So broadening the base and lowering rates. We haven't talked much about corporate tax reform or about small business here, but so many successful small businesses, 3% of the businesses, but half of small business income, some of it's passed through, but some of it's what we normally think of as small business, pay on the personal form. So broader base, lower rates would be very good for their incentives. And we have the highest corporate rate in the world, nominally between federal and state taxes, about 39%, the highest in OECD. The effective rate, when you account for deductions and exemptions and so on, is lower. It's in the high 20s, but it's out of line, but not as far out of line as the statutory rate. So I think that moving in this direction could be very good for the economy in both the short and long run. But it's and I do believe that if it was accurately statically scored, that at least over time it would raise more revenue than is likely being forecast in the models.
Particularly if, as you suggest, we lower the rates and we broaden the base. Would that also tend to have the impact of stabilizing and producing a less volatile revenue stream? You know, it's my understanding our income tax system brings in about 18.5% of GDP on average. We have peaks and valleys within that. I think in 2011 we were in a valley of about 14.5%. At times we've gone just a little over 20%, but generally don't go higher than that. Could lowering the rates and broadening the base produce a more stable code?
It very much would, because the steep progression, some say the rates are too high. I'm not going to argue about the levels, but we have, relative to the other OECD countries, according to the OECD, the most progressive tax system. They have larger tax. They collect more with value-added taxes, but we have a more progressive tax system. It becomes more volatile. The place to see it most is my home state of California, where we have by far the most volatile. We have a very progressive income tax, and we get into this awkward situation, especially with our balanced budget requirements, which are sort of adhered to. We wind up having the revenues flow in, they spend that, they project more, then the crisis hits, we rely heavily on capital gains and stock options across the Silicon Valley, the revenues collapse, it's very hard to cut spending, so we wind up trying to make the tax code more and more progressive, and we wind up not being able to even to fund the basic benefits for people that are really hurting in California.
Tough cycle.
So you're right.
That is a tough cycle. So yeah, that's why I ultimately tend to come to the conclusion that where there's not consensus on everything, we ought to look where there is consensus. There does seem to be a certain amount of political consensus that we need tax reform in the form of simplification. Maybe we could start out with something revenue neutral when it's statically scored, and then see where it takes us. That would leave subsequent Congresses free to either plus up or minus down where they go from there. If I can ask one more question, as my time's expiring.
Of course,
Madam
it looks
Chair.
like it's just the two of us here.
Thank you.
Senator Lee,
Thank you.
so
I
please
appreciate
go
that.
ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In your testimony, Dr. Boskin, you mentioned the need for permanent structural changes, not just a specific dollar cut, while discussing a credible commitment to deficit reduction. Can you speak to us briefly on the importance of maintaining our nation's credibility in deficit reduction packages, and why it is that markets are not going to be satisfied in this regard with cuts? In other words, tell us why cuts just won't cut it anymore.
Well, it turns out that if you look at the history of these budget negotiations, I've been involved in several when I was CEA chair, for example, and advised on others. Sometimes the cuts, quote cuts, unquote, evaporate later. Now, sometimes tax policies change also later. That tends to happen less frequently. There's a lot of frequent changes, but the tax, if you cut tax rates, it becomes a much bigger battle than small changes in spending at the next appropriations hearing. So I think what people want to see in financial markets, what people want to see about what the environment's going to be for investments that are paying off 5 and 7 and 10 years. Now, Austin mentioned infrastructure. A lot of that should be going on in the private sector. Big investments in, he mentioned energy. We can be exporting natural gas. That's going to require firms investing $10 billion for an export terminal. To do that, they have to have some notion of what the taxes they're going to pay on that are when they finally get that investment done and they're starting to export the stuff. And so that's to me, credible means that the rules have changed and they're harder to reverse than just a typical single appropriations bill next year if the makeup of Congress changes and so on. So tax rules, indexing formula, retirement ages phased in over time, things of that sort. We've had a history in the past of those actually occurring, like from the '83 Greenspan Commission, Social Security changes.
These are the kinds of permanent structural reforms
Yeah.
you're referring to as contrasted against something that just occurs in a CR or something.
Yeah, you just say we'll cut $10 billion, and it may happen once or it may not, and the following year it's up for debate again.
Thank you, Dr. Boskin. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much.